Sarah Chen moved through the corridors of Fort Braxton's medical facility like a shadow, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished linoleum floors. At 5 feet 3 inches and weighing no more than a feather, she seemed almost invisible among the towering soldiers who dominated the military base. Her black hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, her scrubs immaculate, and her expression calm and focused. To most people who passed her in the hallways, she was just another face in the crowd, a quiet nurse who did her job without fanfare or recognition. But invisibility came with a price. Sarah had learned to accept the snickers that followed her down the hallways, the jokes about how she needed a stepladder to reach the high shelves, and the constant comments about whether she was old enough to be handling real medical cases. The soldiers, particularly the younger enlisted men, seemed to find endless entertainment in her petite stature and serious demeanor. "Hey, Doc Tiny," called out Sergeant Mitchell as Sarah passed by the break room one Tuesday morning. His voice carried that familiar tone of mock respect that she had grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. "You sure you can handle that big scary clipboard? Need me to carry it for you?" The other soldiers around the table erupted in laughter, slapping their knees and nudging each other with their elbows. Sarah paused for just a moment, her grip tightening almost imperceptibly on her patient files. She had heard variations of this same joke hundreds of times before. Sometimes it was about her height, sometimes about her age, sometimes about her quiet nature. The content changed, but the underlying message was always the same: she didn't belong here among these warriors. "I can manage, thank you," Sarah replied evenly, her voice carrying no trace of irritation or hurt. She had perfected this response over months of practice, keeping her tone professional and neutral. Getting defensive or showing emotion only seemed to encourage them more. As she continued down the hallway, she could hear the conversation continuing behind her. "I swear, they're recruiting nurses from high schools now," Mitchell's voice drifted after her. "That girl looks like she should be studying for her SATs, not treating combat injuries." "Maybe she's one of those child prodigies," another voice chimed in. "You know, graduated medical school when she was 12 or something." More laughter followed, but Sarah had already turned the corner and was focusing on the day ahead. She had 7 patients to check on during her morning rounds, 3 post-operative cases to monitor, and a new arrival coming in from a training accident later that afternoon. There was no time to dwell on hurt feelings or wounded pride. The first stop on her rounds was Private Rodriguez, a 19-year-old who had suffered a severe allergic reaction during a field exercise 3 days earlier. When Sarah entered his room, she found him sitting up in bed, looking much better than he had when he'd first arrived. His breathing was clear, the swelling in his face had gone down completely, and his color had returned to normal. "How are you feeling this morning, Private?" Sarah asked as she checked his chart and began taking his vital signs. "Much better, thanks to you," Rodriguez replied with genuine gratitude. "I heard some of the guys talking about how you knew exactly what to do when I came in. They said I was in pretty bad shape." Sarah wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm and pumped it up, listening carefully through her stethoscope. "You had a severe anaphylactic reaction. Your airway was starting to close, and your blood pressure had dropped significantly. But we caught it in time, and you responded well to treatment. The other nurses seemed pretty stressed when I arrived, but you were completely calm," Rodriguez continued. "Like you'd handled that kind of emergency 1,000 times before." Sarah made notes on his chart, recording his blood pressure, pulse, and respiratory rate. "All normal." "Experience helps," she said simply. "You'll be ready for discharge tomorrow if everything continues to improve." As she moved on to her next patient, Sarah reflected on Rodriguez's words. He was right, she had been calm during his emergency. While the other nurses had been rushing around, calling for doctors, and checking procedure manuals, Sarah had immediately recognized the signs and had already started treatment before the attending physician had even arrived. It wasn't her first anaphylactic reaction case, not by a long shot. Her next patient was Master Sergeant Thompson, a veteran with 20 years of service who was recovering from knee surgery. When Sarah entered his room, she found him struggling to reach the water pitcher on his bedside table. Without hesitation, she moved it within his reach and refilled his cup. "Thank you, Nurse Chen," Thompson said, settling back against his pillows. I've been watching you work these past few days. You're different from the other medical staff here. Different how? Sarah asked as she checked his surgical incision for signs of infection. More confident, I guess. More competent. The way you move, the way you handle emergencies. You remind me of the combat medics I worked with overseas. There's something in your bearing that suggests you've seen real action. Sarah continued her examination without comment, but Thompson's observation hit closer to home than he could possibly know. She cleaned around his incision site with practiced efficiency, noting that the healing was progressing well with no signs of infection or complications. Where did you train? Thompson asked, studying her face carefully. Various places, Sarah replied vaguely. Your incision is healing nicely. The surgeon did excellent work. You should be able to start physical therapy next week. Thompson nodded, but his eyes remained thoughtful. Unlike the younger soldiers who saw only her size and youth, the older veterans sometimes noticed things that made them curious. Their questions were usually more perceptive, more difficult to deflect. Sarah's morning continued with visits to 5 more patients, each requiring different levels of care and attention. There was Lieutenant Hayes, who was recovering from a concussion sustained during a rappelling exercise. Private Johnson, who had developed pneumonia after a cold weather training mission. Corporal Martinez, who was being treated for severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. And Specialist Williams, who had suffered multiple fractures in a vehicle rollover during convoy training. Each patient received the same level of professional, competent care that had become Sarah's trademark. She was thorough in her assessments, gentle in her manner, and always seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. Several patients commented on her skill and bedside manner, noting how much more confident they felt when she was taking care of them. But, despite the positive feedback from her patients, Sarah's reputation among the military personnel remained largely unchanged. To most of them, she was still just the small, quiet nurse who looked too young and too fragile to be working in a military medical facility. This perception was reinforced during lunch when Sarah sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, reading a medical journal while she ate her sandwich. At the table behind her, a group of soldiers was engaged in their usual banter about the medical staff. I don't know why they assigned Shen to the trauma cases, one of them was saying. If I got seriously injured, I'd want someone who could actually lift me onto a gurney. Maybe she has superpowers, another soldier suggested mockingly. You know, like those tiny ants that can lift 10 times their body weight. I heard she fainted during her first surgery observation, a third voice added. Had to be helped out of the operating room. This last comment was completely false, but Sarah didn't turn around to correct it. She had learned that defending herself often only led to more elaborate stories and increased scrutiny. Instead, she finished her sandwich, closed her medical journal, and returned to the medical facility to prepare for the afternoon shift. The afternoon brought new challenges and new patients. A training accident at the obstacle course had resulted in several minor injuries, mostly cuts, bruises, and a dislocated shoulder. Sarah worked efficiently to treat each case, documenting everything carefully and ensuring that each soldier received appropriate follow-up care. As she was finishing her documentation, Dr. Patterson, the chief medical officer, approached her desk. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who had been practicing military medicine for over 2 decades. Unlike many of the younger staff, Dr. Patterson had always treated Sarah with respect and had never seemed to doubt her competence. Excellent work on the Rodriguez case yesterday, Chen, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Your quick response and accurate diagnosis prevented what could have been a fatal reaction. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied, looking up from her charts. I was glad we caught it when we did. Where did you encounter anaphylaxis cases during your training? Dr. Patterson asked. Your response was textbook perfect, but it also had the kind of automatic precision that usually comes from field experience. Sarah hesitated for just a moment. I did some emergency medicine rotations during nursing school. We had several allergy cases come through the ER. Dr. Patterson nodded, but, like Master Sergeant Thompson, he seemed to sense that there was more to Sarah's background than she was revealing. Well, whatever your experience, your skills are a real asset to this facility. I hope you know that your work here is valued, regardless of what some of the younger soldiers might say. After Dr. Patterson left, Sarah sat quietly at her desk, staring at the patient files in front of her. She appreciated his words of support, but they also reminded her of the constant undercurrent of doubt and dismissal that surrounded her position here. Every day was a careful balance of doing her job well while remaining invisible enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention or questions. As her shift ended, Sarah gathered her things and headed toward the parking lot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base, and she could hear the distant sounds of evening training exercises. Helicopters rumbled overhead, their rotors beating a familiar rhythm that stirred memories she preferred to keep buried. Walking to her car, she passed a group of soldiers engaged in combat training. They were practicing tactical movements, communication procedures, and emergency response scenarios. Sarah watched them for a moment, noting their techniques, their coordination, their attention to detail. To a casual observer, she might have seemed like any off-duty medical staff member watching the training with mild interest. But someone with a trained eye might have noticed the way she automatically assessed their formation, the way her gaze tracked their movements with the precision of someone who understood military tactics, and the way she unconsciously evaluated their equipment and procedures. These small details would have suggested that Sarah Chen's familiarity with military operations went far beyond what most base medical personnel would possess. As she drove home to her small apartment off base, Sarah reflected on another day of careful navigation through a world where she was simultaneously essential and overlooked. Tomorrow would bring more patients, more challenges, and undoubtedly more comments about her size, her age, and her apparent unsuitability for military medical work. But Sarah had learned to find satisfaction in the work itself, in the patients she helped, and in the knowledge that she was making a difference despite the skepticism that surrounded her. She had also learned to live with secrets, to carry knowledge that could never be shared, and to maintain a facade that protected both herself and others from truths that were better left buried. What Sarah didn't know as she pulled into her apartment complex that evening was that tomorrow would bring a crisis that would shatter her carefully maintained invisibility and force her to confront the very past she had worked so hard to leave behind. The quiet nurse who had spent 2 years deflecting questions and avoiding attention was about to face a situation where silence would no longer be an option. The emergency alarm pierced through the usual morning routine of Fort Braxton like a knife through silk. Sarah was in the middle of reviewing patient charts when the urgent klaxon echoed throughout the medical facility, followed immediately by the base-wide announcement system crackling to life. All medical personnel report to stations immediately. Incoming emergency. Multiple casualties. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. She dropped her charts and moved toward the emergency bay with smooth, practiced efficiency. Around her, the medical facility transformed from its usual calm environment into a hive of urgent activity. Nurses ran to prepare trauma bays, doctors grabbed emergency kits, and orderlies rushed to set up additional equipment. Dr. Patterson appeared in the main corridor, his usually calm demeanor replaced by focused intensity. "What do we know?" he called out to the charge nurse. "Special Forces training exercise went wrong," came the reply. "Helicopter crash in the mountains. Multiple injuries, unknown severity. First responders are reporting difficult extraction conditions due to terrain and weather." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Helicopter crash. Mountains. Weather conditions. The combination of factors brought back memories she had spent 2 years trying to suppress. She forced herself to focus on the present, on the preparations that needed to be made for the incoming casualties. The next hour passed in a blur of activity as the medical team prepared for what could be a mass casualty event. Trauma bays were cleared and equipped, blood supplies were checked and organized, and surgical teams were placed on standby. Through it all, Sarah worked with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs and ensuring that every detail was covered. But, as the morning wore on, communication from the crash site became increasingly disturbing. The weather in the mountains had deteriorated rapidly, with heavy rain and high winds making rescue operations extremely difficult. The terrain where the helicopter had gone down was described as nearly inaccessible, with steep cliffs and dense forest coverage. The medevac helicopters can't get close enough for extraction, reported the communications officer during one of the hourly updates. They're having to land almost 2 miles from the crash site and attempt ground evacuation through extremely difficult terrain. Sarah listened to these reports with growing unease. She had heard similar descriptions before, in very different circumstances and in places far from North Carolina. The combination of weather, terrain, and time pressure created a situation that she recognized all too well. By noon, it became clear that the standard rescue protocols were not going to be sufficient. 3 separate medevac attempts had been forced to turn back due to weather conditions, and ground teams were reporting that it could take hours to reach the crash site, let alone evacuate casualties back to medical facilities. During the lunch briefing, Dr. Patterson's frustration was evident. "We have at least 4 confirmed casualties, possibly more. Initial reports suggest serious injuries including head trauma, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures. But we can't help them if we can't reach them." "What about bringing in specialized rescue equipment?" suggested one of the senior nurses. "Already tried," replied the base commander, Colonel Harrison, who had joined the briefing. "The terrain is too rough for ground vehicles, and the weather has grounded all but the most essential aircraft. We're looking at potentially losing people who could be saved if we could just get medical attention to them quickly." Sarah sat quietly in the back of the room, listening to the discussion of options that were being exhausted one by one. Part of her wanted to speak up, to offer suggestions based on experience that these good people could never imagine she possessed. But speaking up would require explanations that she wasn't prepared to give. The afternoon brought worse news. Radio contact with the crash site had been intermittent, but the latest reports suggested that at least one of the casualties was in critical condition and deteriorating rapidly. Time was running out, and conventional rescue methods were proving inadequate. It was during the 3 o'clock briefing that everything changed. Colonel Harrison stood at the front of the room, his face grave as he delivered the latest update. "I've just received word that we're going to attempt one more rescue mission using a specially modified Apache helicopter. The pilot believes he can get closer to the crash site than the medevac helicopters, but it's going to be extremely dangerous. The aircraft will be operating at the absolute edge of its capabilities in these weather conditions." Dr. Patterson frowned. "An Apache isn't equipped for medical evacuation. How are we supposed to treat casualties in a combat helicopter?" "That's the problem," Colonel Harrison replied. "We need someone who can provide immediate medical care in extremely challenging conditions. Someone small enough to fit in the limited space available, experienced enough to handle trauma cases, and, well, brave enough to volunteer for what could be a very dangerous mission." The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. They were asking for a medical volunteer to fly into a dangerous situation in weather that had already grounded multiple aircraft, to reach casualties through terrain so difficult that ground teams couldn't navigate it, and to provide medical care in the cramped confines of a combat helicopter. Sarah felt every eye in the room assess the medical staff present. Most of the doctors were too large to fit comfortably in an Apache's limited passenger space. The male nurses were similarly sized. Several of the female nurses might have fit physically, but lacked the trauma experience necessary for such a critical mission. "I'll go." Sarah's voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the silent room. Every head turned toward her, and she could see the immediate skepticism on many faces. "Chen," Dr. Patterson said gently, "this isn't a standard medical call. The conditions are going to be extremely dangerous, and the physical demands." "I'm qualified," Sarah interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying a new note of authority that made several people sit up straighter. "I have extensive trauma experience, I'm small enough to fit in the aircraft, and I'm not afraid of flying in challenging conditions." Colonel Harrison studied her carefully. Like Dr. Patterson and Master Sergeant Thompson, he seemed to sense something beneath Sarah's quiet exterior that didn't match her apparent background. "What kind of trauma experience are we talking about, Nurse Chen?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Enough to handle whatever I might find at that crash site, sir." For a long moment, the room remained silent as Colonel Harrison weighed his options. He had a group of critically injured soldiers who needed immediate medical attention, weather conditions that were preventing conventional rescue operations, and only one volunteer who met the physical requirements for the mission. "The pilot has the final say," he said finally. "If he's willing to take you, and if you're certain you want to volunteer, then we'll move forward with the mission." Sarah nodded. "I'm certain, sir." As the briefing broke up and preparations for the rescue mission began, Sarah found herself the center of unprecedented attention. The same soldiers who had been making jokes about her size and competence just days before were now looking at her with mixtures of surprise, skepticism, and grudging respect. "You sure about this, Chen?" asked Sergeant Mitchell, approaching her as she gathered her medical kit. His usual mocking tone was replaced by genuine concern. "I mean, no offense, but this isn't exactly a routine medical call." "I'm sure," Sarah replied, checking the contents of her trauma kit and adding additional supplies for field conditions. "Where'd you get trauma experience anyway?" Mitchell pressed. "I thought you were fresh out of nursing school." Sarah looked up at him, and, for just a moment, he caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that made him step back slightly. There was a depth of experience there, a familiarity with danger and crisis that seemed completely at odds with the quiet, unassuming nurse he thought he knew. "Experience comes in many forms, Sergeant," she said simply, then returned to her preparations. 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself walking across the tarmac toward an Apache helicopter that sat waiting like a mechanical predator. The wind from the approaching storm whipped her hair around her face, and she could hear the distant rumble of thunder growing closer. The pilot who met her at the aircraft was Captain Marcus Stone, a veteran aviator with over 15 years of experience flying in combat zones around the world. He was tall, weathered, and had the kind of calm confidence that came from having survived situations where others hadn't. "So you're the volunteer," he said, having to raise his voice over the wind. "I'm not going to lie to you, this is going to be one of the most dangerous flights I've ever attempted. The weather is marginal at best, the terrain is unforgiving, and we're going to be operating at the absolute limits of what this aircraft can do." Sarah nodded, shouldering her medical kit. "I understand the risks, Captain." "Do you?" Stone studied her carefully. "Because once we take off, there's no turning back. If something goes wrong out there, we might not make it back. Are you prepared for that possibility?" "Yes," Sarah replied without hesitation. Captain Stone continued to study her for another moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then. Let's go save some lives." As they climbed into the Apache, Sarah found herself in the familiar environment of a military aircraft preparing for a dangerous mission. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, the sound of instruments being checked and systems coming online, the tension that filled the air before a high-risk operation, all of it triggered memories that she had worked hard to suppress. "Communications check," Captain Stone's voice crackled through the headset as the helicopter's engines spun up to takeoff power. "Medical team ready," Sarah responded, her voice steady and professional. As the Apache lifted off from the tarmac and turned toward the mountains, Sarah caught a glimpse of the medical facility shrinking below them. She could see small figures standing outside, watching their departure. Among them, she knew, were the soldiers who had spent 2 years questioning her competence, her experience, and her place in their world. What none of them knew, what Sarah had never told anyone, was that this wasn't her first time flying into danger to reach wounded soldiers. It wasn't her first time providing medical care under extreme conditions, and it certainly wasn't her first time facing the possibility of not making it home. The quiet nurse who had endured their jokes and skepticism for 2 years was about to confront a past that would explain everything they had never understood about her. But, first, she had to survive the next few hours and bring home soldiers who were counting on her skills that went far beyond anything a typical base nurse should possess. As the Apache banked toward the storm-covered mountains, Sarah checked her medical equipment one final time and prepared to do what she had done many times before, in places much more dangerous than the mountains of North Carolina. The only difference was that this time, she wouldn't be able to disappear back into anonymity when the mission was over. The Apache helicopter cut through the storm like a mechanical warrior fighting against the elements themselves. Rain hammered against the aircraft's armor plating with the intensity of machine gun fire, while wind gusts threatened to throw them off course with every mile they traveled toward the mountains. Sarah sat in the gunner's compartment, her medical kit secured beside her, watching the terrain below disappear into a gray curtain of rain and low-hanging clouds. Captain Stone's voice crackled through the headset communication system, calm despite the increasingly dangerous flying conditions. ETA to crash site is 15 minutes. Weather's getting worse, but we're committed now. How are you holding up back there, Chen? All good, Captain, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence that was making the helicopter buck and roll like an angry bronco. Medical equipment secured and ready for deployment. Through the limited visibility, Sarah could make out the rugged terrain they were approaching. Dense forest covered steep mountainsides that rose sharply from narrow valleys, creating a landscape that would challenge even experienced ground rescue teams under perfect conditions. In the current weather, it was nearly impossible to navigate safely. I'm picking up the emergency beacon, Captain Stone announced. Crash site is approximately 2 miles ahead, but I'm not seeing any clear landing zones. We're going to have to get creative. Sarah leaned forward to peer through the rain-streaked window, using skills she hadn't actively employed in over 2 years. Her eyes automatically scanned the terrain below, looking for potential landing sites, assessing approach angles, and calculating distances. These weren't skills that most medical personnel possessed, but they came naturally to her now, like muscle memory from another life. There, she said, pointing to a small clearing barely visible through the trees. That ridge line about a quarter-mile east of the beacon. It's narrow, but it might be wide enough for a temporary landing. Captain Stone followed her direction and banked the helicopter toward the location she had identified. Good eye, he said, clearly impressed. That's exactly the kind of spot I was looking for. Most people wouldn't even notice it from this altitude. As they approached the crash site, the scene below became tragically clear. The downed helicopter lay twisted and broken among the trees, its rotors shattered and its fuselage crumpled from the impact. Even from their current altitude, Sarah could see figures moving around the wreckage, survivors who were still mobile and attempting to help their injured teammates. I count at least 6 people down there, Captain Stone reported. Some are moving, some aren't. How close do you need to get to start medical assessment? As close as you can safely manage, Sarah replied, already running through trauma protocols in her mind. I'll need to reach them quickly to assess injuries and stabilize anyone in critical condition before we can attempt evacuation. The landing was a masterpiece of aviation skill under impossible conditions. Captain Stone managed to set the Apache down on a rocky outcropping barely wider than the helicopter's landing gear, with trees pressing in on all sides and wind gusts that threatened to push them over the edge at any moment. The moment the skids touched down, Sarah was out of the aircraft and moving toward the crash site with her medical kit. The scene that greeted her was heartbreakingly familiar. Wounded soldiers, some conscious and alert, others unconscious and bleeding, scattered around the wreckage of their aircraft. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with blood and fear created an atmosphere that transported Sarah instantly back to places and times she had tried to forget. But there was no time for memory or hesitation. She moved among the casualties with swift efficiency, her small size allowing her to navigate through the debris and tight spaces where larger rescuers might have struggled. Her initial assessment revealed 4 seriously wounded soldiers and 2 with minor injuries who were already providing first aid to their teammates. Medical personnel, she announced as she approached the first casualty, a young lieutenant who was conscious but had obviously suffered significant head trauma. I'm Nurse Chen from Fort Braxton. I'm here to help. The relief on the faces of the uninjured soldiers was immediate and profound. They had been trying to provide first aid for hours, but lacked the training and equipment necessary to deal with the severity of some injuries. Thank God, said Sergeant First Class Martinez, who had a deep gash on his arm but was still mobile. Lieutenant Collins over there has been unconscious for almost 3 hours, and Private Anderson's breathing has been getting worse. Sarah quickly moved to Lieutenant Collins, kneeling beside him in the mud and rain. Her assessment was swift and professional, severe concussion, possible skull fracture, but vital signs stable. She immobilized his neck and head, then moved to Private Anderson, who was indeed showing signs of respiratory distress. Pneumothorax, she diagnosed quickly, recognizing the symptoms of a collapsed lung. Without hesitation, she opened her medical kit and began preparing for a procedure that would relieve the pressure in his chest cavity. Her movements were precise and confident, the kind of field medicine that required extensive experience with trauma cases. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked Sergeant Martinez, watching in amazement as Sarah performed the needle decompression that immediately improved Anderson's breathing. "Various places," Sarah replied, the same vague answer she had given countless times before. But, here, in the mud and rain with wounded soldiers depending on her skills, the question carried different weight. She continued her assessment and treatment of the casualties, stabilizing each one according to the severity of their injuries. Her efficiency and competence were remarkable, but even more impressive was her calm demeanor under pressure. While the storm raged around them and the situation remained extremely dangerous, Sarah worked with the kind of focused intensity that inspired confidence in everyone around her. "Chen, we need to start moving people," Captain Stone's voice crackled through her radio. "Weather's getting worse, and I don't know how much longer I can keep the aircraft stable in this wind." "Roger that," Sarah replied. "I have 1 critical, 2 serious, and 1 walking wounded ready for first evacuation. The critical needs immediate surgery." The evacuation process was complicated by the difficult terrain and weather conditions. Each casualty had to be carefully moved through the forest debris and up the steep slope to where the Apache waited. Sarah coordinated the effort, directing the uninjured soldiers while monitoring the condition of each patient. It was during the second evacuation run that things became truly dangerous. As they loaded Private Anderson into the helicopter, a massive wind gust caught the aircraft and nearly lifted it off the unstable landing site. Captain Stone fought to maintain control, but it was clear that conditions were rapidly becoming impossible. "That's it," he announced over the radio. "We need to get out of here now, or we're going to become casualties ourselves." "Negative," Sarah replied firmly. "We still have 2 seriously injured soldiers down there. I'm not leaving without them." "Chen, I understand your commitment, but if we stay much longer, we might not be able to take off at all. These wind conditions are beyond safe operating limits." Sarah looked back toward the crash site, where Lieutenant Collins and Specialist Williams remained with the 2 uninjured soldiers. Collins was still unconscious with his head injury, and Williams had internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. Leaving them would likely mean losing them both. "Give me 10 more minutes," she said. "I can stabilize them for transport and get them up here." "Chen," Captain Stone began. 10 minutes, Sarah interrupted, and there was something in her voice that made him pause. It wasn't just determination or courage, it was the absolute certainty of someone who had faced exactly this kind of decision before and knew what needed to be done. "Roger," Captain Stone replied after a moment. 10 minutes, then, we're gone regardless." Sarah sprinted back down the slope toward the remaining casualties, her medical kit bouncing against her hip as she navigated through the treacherous terrain. The rain had made everything slippery and dangerous, but she moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had learned to operate in hostile environments. When she reached Lieutenant Collins, she found his condition had deteriorated. His breathing was becoming irregular, and his responses were growing weaker. She made the difficult decision to administer a medication that would stabilize his condition but required careful monitoring during transport. Specialist Williams presented a different challenge. His internal injuries were serious, and moving him carried significant risks. But leaving him wasn't an option. Sarah made quick decisions about pain management and bleeding control, preparing him as best she could for what would be a difficult evacuation. "We need to move now," she told the remaining soldiers. "Help me get them up to the helicopter." The next 8 minutes were a blur of desperate effort and careful coordination. Moving 2 seriously injured soldiers up a muddy, debris-filled slope in a storm while maintaining their medical stability required every skill Sarah possessed. But, somehow, through a combination of medical expertise, physical determination, and sheer willpower, they managed it. As the last casualty was loaded into the Apache, Captain Stone was already beginning takeoff procedures. "Outstanding work, Chen," he said as the helicopter lifted off from the precarious landing site. "I don't know how you did that." Sarah was busy monitoring her patients during the flight back to Fort Braxton, but part of her mind was already anticipating what would happen when they landed. Her performance during the rescue had been far beyond what anyone at the base would have expected from the quiet nurse they thought they knew. Questions would be asked, and her carefully maintained anonymity would be impossible to preserve. As the Apache approached Fort Braxton's landing zone, Sarah could see the medical team waiting to receive the casualties. Ambulances, surgical teams, and emergency equipment were all in position. Dr. Patterson stood at the front of the group, ready to coordinate the handoff of patients to the hospital. The moment they touched down, the area erupted in controlled chaos as medical teams moved to transfer the casualties to waiting ambulances. Sarah provided rapid briefings on each patient's condition and treatment, ensuring seamless continuity of care as they were rushed to surgery. But, even in the midst of the medical emergency, she was aware of the looks she was receiving from the gathered personnel. Word had already spread throughout the base about the rescue mission, and everyone wanted to see the nurse who had volunteered to fly into a storm to reach wounded soldiers. "Excellent work, Chen," Dr. Patterson said as the last ambulance departed for the hospital. "Your quick thinking and field medical skills probably saved at least 2 lives today." "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied, but she knew that her answer would no longer be sufficient. Too many people had witnessed her competence under extreme pressure, her familiarity with field medicine, and her calm professionalism in a crisis situation. As she walked back toward the medical facility to complete her reports, Sarah realized that her 2 years of quiet anonymity at Fort Braxton were over. The rescue mission had been successful, but it had also revealed capabilities and experience that didn't match her official background. Sometimes the people we overlook, dismiss, or even mock turn out to be the very ones who hold the power to save us. In a world where uniforms often determine respect and rank dictates worth, one woman's quiet strength would soon silence every critic and prove that true heroism doesn't always wear combat boots or carry weapons. What happens when years of ridicule and dismissal suddenly collide with a moment of desperate need? When the very person everyone underestimated becomes the only hope for survival? This is the story of Sarah Chen, a base nurse who endured countless jokes about her small stature, quiet demeanor, and seemingly ordinary role until the day an Apache helicopter descended from the storm-filled sky with a call that would change everything. The truth about Sarah's past was buried deeper than military classified files, hidden behind scrubs and a stethoscope. But some secrets can't stay buried forever, especially when lives hang in the balance and only one person possesses the skills to bridge the gap between life and death. Get ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about heroes, courage, and the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight among us.